Nintex Workflow 2007 extends Microsoft SharePoint 2007 to provide advanced workflow capabilities using a graphical, browser-based interface. The best way to understand Nintex Workflow 2007 is with a guided tour, and we'll do that by creating a workflow. In this case, we'll design a workflow to automate a request for capital expenditure. You could use a Microsoft Word or InfoPath document as a standard form, or you could use a SharePoint list. In this case, we'll use a SharePoint list, making it easier to refer to information from the list itself as we design the workflow. So we first create a list called Capital Expenditure Request, then add columns that will store the information. The first is for the amount, which is set to be a currency column. For the purposes of this introduction, that's the important piece of information, so it's all we'll create. However, this is only a simple example of the information that could be required. A more realistic example would require descriptions and various other details. We now head back into the list to create the workflow. The Nintex Workflow options are integrated into the SharePoint Settings menu. Click the Settings button, then the Create Workflow link. The Workflow template gallery will appear. Using the gallery, you can load up a predefined workflow or a blank workflow. The gallery contains detailed information about each workflow template. Workflow designers can also choose to save a workflow into the gallery from the workflow design canvas. In this case, we'll start by selecting the blank template. We are now presented with the Workflow Designer page, which comprises two major sections. At the left of the page is the Workflow Actions palette, while the section on the right, occupying the majority of the page, is the Design Canvas. The Actions palette displays the activities that can be used in the Design Canvas to create workflows. They're divided into groups of related actions. Click the heading of a group to expand or contract it. Mouse over an action for a more detailed description about its use. If you design a complex workflow, the Actions palette can become lost because it remains anchored to the top of the page. Nintex Workflow provides the option to detach the palette from the left navigation area by clicking the pin at the top. The palette will then float and can be dragged around the page. Click the pin again to reattach it to the left navigation area. To design a workflow, you need to add actions to the design canvas. You can choose one of two ways to add an action. You can drag and drop an action from the Actions palette onto a blue pearl on the design canvas. Or you can right-click a pearl on the canvas, mouse over Insert Activity, and select the action you require from the list. Now we can concentrate on the specifics of creating our capital expenditure workflow. The first step will be to acknowledge receipt of the expenditure request by sending a notification to the user making the request. To do that, we drag and drop a Send a Notification action onto a pearl. The Actions icon will appear with a warning symbol. Hover over the icon for details about the warning. Most commonly, it indicates what needs to be configured. To configure the action, use the drop-down menu, or simply double-click the Actions icon. To add a recipient, click the address book icon. You can now add users that are part of your environment's global address list. If you're working with people outside of your organization, you can add email addresses manually. Alternatively, you can add a user dynamically, using information that is looked up by the workflow. Such options include the initiator, who is the user that causes the workflow to start, the initiator's manager, or a user associated in some other way with the item in the workflow. In this case, we will use the initiator. We now add an appropriate subject line for the notification, and we can also fill in the content area. In addition to typed information, the content area can also be dynamically populated with information from the library or list in which the workflow is functioning. To do so, click the Insert Reference link. For this example, we want to include the amount entered into the SharePoint list. When a reference is used, it appears underlined in red font. Click the Save button when finished. Workflow actions can also be labelled to make the workflow as a whole easier to read and understand. Use the Actions drop-down, click the Edit Labels link, and enter the text required. The next step will be to drag on a request approval action. A request for approval can either finish up approved or rejected, and the workflow path is drawn automatically to reflect the two possible outcomes. We can now configure the action. The approval process can involve one person or as many as you like. There are a number of options that can be used that essentially revolve around the number of users required to approve a document for it to be considered approved or rejected. For this stage of the workflow, we're going to use one approver, the initiator's manager. Click the Address Book button, expand the Lookup section, and select Manager. The identity of the manager will be automatically read from the user's Active Directory profile. An exclusive feature of Nintex Workflow 2007 is Lazy Approval. Lazy Approval allows users set as approvers to approve or reject a workflow item by simply replying to the request notification. A system administrator can nominate which terms are used and what their outcome will be. This option can be especially useful when the notification email contains all the information necessary for the approver to make a decision. Click in the checkbox for the Lazy Approval settings to take effect. We can now enter the message that will be sent to the approvers requesting their approval. The notification message can be individualized for each of the requested approvers. With the relevant information filled in, we can save the configuration and return to the design canvas. We now have to set workflow actions for when the request is approved and when it's declined. In the left branch, which is the declined branch, add another Send a Notification action to inform the workflow initiator of the decision. A good idea for that sort of notification is to include the approver's comments in the body. The other outcome, the declined request, will result in the workflow ending. In the event that the initiator's manager approves the request, a decision point needs to be set up that analyzes the amount being requested and routes the document one of two ways. If the request is for under $20,000, then the initiator's manager's approval is enough. If it is more, the request will have to go to the Chief Financial Officer. To accomplish the analysis, we drag a Set a Condition action onto the PERL of the approved branch. The first drop-down selects the source of information to make the basis of a comparison for the decision. In this case, it's a field in the list we created earlier, Capital Expenditure Request. There are also many other options available where you can integrate with the information in your SharePoint environment. Based on the selection in the first drop-down, the second drop-down allows amount to be chosen. The next drop-down, the third, allows us to choose a condition type for our workflow action. In this case, the appropriate condition type is greater than. The fourth field is where, in this case, we set the amount. We first click on the Lookup button. Then select Value from the drop-down, set the amount to be 20,000 and click OK. The condition should now be able to be read in relatively plain language. When the amount is greater than 20,000, the outcome is yes. When the condition statement is complete, click Save. You can now set the action's labels to describe the condition. If the amount of the request is for over $20,000, we will need to add another Request Approval action to the workflow, this time configured to request approval from the Chief Financial Officer. Configure the action, adding in the Chief Financial Officer as the approver. In this scenario, we have only the one approver. However, in a more realistic scenario, there may be 3 users added, who may all have to approve the request. To complete the workflow, we can add the rest of the communication formalities by copying and pasting an action that we configured earlier. To do so, activate the Actions drop-down menu and select Copy. Then right-click on the PERL where you want to add the action and select Paste. You can then change the settings for the new action, which in this case will simply be a minor change in the message body. You could also use the Copy and Paste action with the Set Approval Status action. With our workflow now complete, we can configure information about it and how it will be triggered using the Settings menu. First, we'll set the title of the workflow and its description. When published, it will appear in the list of available workflows for this list, so the name and description can be quite important. We can also set up the conditions that will cause the workflow to be initiated. Click the Settings button again, then choose Startup Options. The Start Manually option can be enabled at the same time as Start when items are created and Start when items are modified. That way, a document can be resubmitted to a workflow if it has previously completed it. You can also configure an expected duration, which will help determine the visual status of the warning icon in the My Workflow Tasks web part. To make the workflow active in the SharePoint list, click the Actions button and select the Publish option, which saves the workflow and associates it with the list ready for use. Now, whenever a new request is created or changed in our capital expenditure list, it will automatically enter the workflow we created. To summarize, our workflow will send a notification of request to the initiator of the workflow, that is, the person who makes the request for capital expenditure, seek approval from the initiator's manager for the request, allow approvers to use lazy approval by replying to a workflow notification using an email-enabled device, analyze the amount being requested by the initiator and determine if the request will also require approval by the CFO, request approval from the CFO if necessary, classify the request as approved or declined within SharePoint, notify the initiator of the result of all possible outcomes. Nintex Workflow 2007 can also be used with all sorts of integration actions, including calling a web service, executing an SQL command, and automating SharePoint creation and modification tasks. You can also interact with data obtained from within the SharePoint environment and automate business processes. We hope you found this video to be informative. This video showcases only some of the functionality of Nintex Workflow 2007, so we invite you to test the features yourself through a free trial or hosted team site.